movies?
Well, we did more or less. I mean, that's so the show is late. I'm Zane Simon, and this is Connor Rebish. We are here to do the MMA Vivisection. We are running late because Connor asked me a question about movies innocently.
I mean, I was I was like 8 minutes late already, but then I wanted to know what Zane's pick for like most must-watch movie of all time was. We got into a conversation about 70s filmmakers and the 80s blockbuster makers and stuff like that. So
yeah, the short answer was if you're actually interested, Chinatown, but the the long answer is much longer. Anyway, we are here to talk about UFC 204, which is getting a lot of, I don't know if it's getting a lot of hate, but it's getting a lot of
It seems to be, and I'm not really sure why. I think it's because the main card doesn't have the name appeal that people want, but altogether, I'm pretty happy with this card.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's weirdly, it's one of those main cards that actually, like, I think it's a main card designed for, especially for people in the industry, like MMA writers, to hate. And everybody else to be fine with. Like, I don't expect this to fail wildly because, Vitor Belfort is a pretty decent draw and star, and Michael Bisping versus Dan Henderson is a fight that has a ton of resonance with fans. And people know who Stefan Struve is. They might even know who Ovince St. Preux is at this point. And so it's a fight. It's a card that I expect people who are just looking at it casually to be like, I want to see that.
Yeah, we'll probably get into this more later too, but I think I'm probably one of the only MMA media members I know who doesn't really feel offended by Bisping Henderson 2 happening at this point in time. I know a lot of people, Henderson doesn't deserve it, or there are more deserving contenders. There are people who deserve their shots at the title, but let's be honest, we didn't think we'd be here with Michael Bisping as the champion. And Michael Bisping wants his revenge, and I think he has earned a little bit of slack in the leash over the years by never, ever, ever turning down a fight with anybody. Michael Bisping has been the go-to guy for every struggling fighter to call out, and the guy that most fighters who aren't struggling usually want to avoid, and he's fought anybody they put in front of him. Let him get his chance at revenge, and let Dan Henderson get his chance at a UFC title. The man's accomplished every other title that means anything. At the time he was competing in this sport, he's had a 2-decade career. Let the man get his shot.
I would also say too, because I've defended it to the hilt a few times, and I was even one of the first people. The moment Michael Bisping knocked out Luke Rockhold, I was on Twitter, I was running the BE Twitter account. I was like, so when are they making this Dan Henderson fight? It's Dan Henderson won on the same card. They got to make that fight, and the thing is that a Michael Bisping as champion is weird as shit. It is just really, really weird. If you have anyone to blame for that, it's Luke Rockhold. And if you're gonna have a weird champ, you should take advantage and put together weird fights. What's the point of having a champion like Michael Bisping fall into your lap if you're not going to put together the kind of fights that make the most use out of that? You just throw Jacare in there and Jacare beats him, and then what do you have?
Exactly. You're not going to have – Bisping is not going to be a long-reigning champ. I mean, almost certainly not. Granted, we said he wasn't going to beat Rockhold, but slim chances become slimmer and slimmer. When winning 3 fights that you're not supposed to win is a lot harder than winning 1 fight you're not supposed to win. And Dan Henderson was going to be done. Yeah. That was going to be his last fight against Hector Lombard. So you basically have your last chance to make a strong narrative fight between one of the most marketable fighters in the UFC and Michael Bisping, and one of the most beloved veterans in MMA history, and Dan Henderson. Why not make it now? It's not going to. Chance isn't going to come again.
And and with Bisping up there, you can put together. And I want to see. I don't want Jacare to get passed over for his career. That would be bad. But you could legitimately put together a Michael, if Vitor Belfort won, you can do Michael Bisping versus Vitor Belfort as a legit fight. If Rashad Evans beats Tim Kennedy, you can do Rashad Evans versus Michael Bisping as a legit title fight. Like, all of these dudes have beat Michael Bisping and beat him soundly before.
I think I would be okay with Michael Bisping just going on a revenge tour for a title run. I would be fine with that.
It would be fine. Like I say, I don't want to see Jacare get passed over. But when you have somebody like Michael Bisping fall into a title picture, like, you've got so much to work with there, It would be like Ian McCall becoming flyweight champ or something, and suddenly you're like, all these dudes have beat you. I mean, you're good and fun, but like everybody has a claim to try and take this belt from you now. And that's kind of what Bisping is it's just like all these people have a claim to try and take a belt off him because they've all beat him before. So, I'm really happy to see this fight. And if we never get a weird fight, another weird Michael Bisping title fight after it, then I'm really going to be happy we got at least one.
Yeah, me too.
So, on that note, let's go down to our opening bout, the prelim opener, a fight I'm actually really excited for. We're going to try to keep things short-ish for some of these, but I'm excited about a few of these fights. This first one, most notably, Lucas Sayevsky versus Mark Diakese.
Is it Diakese?
I think so.
Should I take this?
Yes.
Well, Mark Diakese probably isn't grateful that Reza Madadi pulled out, but maybe he should be. I think that, like the UFC loves to do, was probably a pretty tough matchup for him coming in. Not that it wasn't an unwinnable fight. I was going to pick him going into that, but Madadi is very scrappy and has a lot of experience and, doesn't mind taking the fight wherever it needs to go to win. And Diakese is a very well-rounded prospect, but one who, like a lot of young fighters, he fights kind of brashly. He makes some mistakes. He puts himself into bad positions. I recall his was it his last fight? No, his last two both ended really quickly. It was probably the fight before.
3
I'm going to
fights
look
ago. Yeah,
sure
the Jack McGann fight.
Jack McGann. And maybe a couple of them. And basically, like, Diakese gets put on his back going for a kind of a sacrifice throw or like a lateral drop, foot sweep kind of takedown, and then does it again the next round. It's like, that's not something he will probably be doing in a few years, but it's the kind of thing that Reza Madadi could have really taken advantage of. Łukasz Sayevsky is, again, his UFC run's not been good, but I think he's better than he looks. He's still a more forgiving opponent than Madadi, especially on short notice, for a grapple-happy power striker like Diakese.
Yeah, and especially I think the thing we're seeing with Diakese too, the reason I'm really excited about him is that after that McGann fight, it seems like I don't know if that was a wake-up call, but we've seen significant growth fight to fight from him since that McGann fight. Even if these fights have been very brief, immediately, like in that fight, Diakese had no semblance of a jab. He had no semblance of a real boxing game, really. Like, he was in there throwing all these really awkward power kicks, winging big, like, wide hooks, and then just diving in on power takedowns. And since that, suddenly he's got a wide base. He's crafted. He's working on a jab. We really saw it show up in his last fight. He's working behind one. And he looks like a much more careful, mindful fighter who's learning to be better defensively and better offensively.
Young Hendo.
Yeah.
And grindy grappler discovers that he has a killer right hand.
Yeah, and I mean, he's an MMA native, so it's not like he came from some grappling background or something like that. He's just learning all the game at once. And I think it's good to it was good to see that he was a very willing wrestler when he was not a great striker, because it shows that he knew like where he should take the fight. But
Sherdog says he used to be at All Stars.
He's trained there off and on. Yeah.
Oh, I guess I'm kind of surprised they matched him with Madadi then.
Yeah, well, his main base camp is Atherton Submission Wrestling, but he's spent time at All Stars.
So maybe that explains his wrestling game, working with all those Swedish wrestlers.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it was like his first camp there was maybe the McGann fight or one of his last couple fights. Like, he hasn't been there long. Mm. But I think it's just he seems kind of like the best end product that you hope to see out of an MMA native, out of somebody who just started in MMA, which is that they're a great athlete and they're covering for flaws with other skills as they go. So he has to stay. I think he doesn't have to, but he'd do well to stay out of wrestling and grappling exchanges against Sayevsky. If he gets sloppy and gives up a lot of position, Sayevsky has a win over Marcin Held. It's not like he's not able to.
He's scrappy, man. He's scrappy. He's scrambly. He hits pretty hard. He gets aggressive when he needs to. Sayevsky has not had a chance to show it, and if he doesn't hear, he'll probably be cut from the UFC, but he is a solid fighter.
He is. He's just not a great athlete. That's the big problem for him. And good athletes have been able to shut his game down, and Diakise is a great athlete. Yeah. So, picking Diakise here. I don't know if I'd pick him I'd probably pick him to get a KO, probably, with his natural power. If he can keep this fight standing for extended amounts of time, then it's hard not to see him being able to hit Sayevsky hard enough to put him away. The odds on this fight, Diakise is the favorite, -200 to -230. Sayevsky, the underdog, +191 to +160. So that all seems about right for me. It's not a huge line.
Yeah.
That brings us to our next fight, prelim bout, another lightweight bout, Leonardo Santos versus Adriano Martins. This is an interesting fight. It's a little hard for me to predict how this fight's going to go, because Santos is a much better and slightly worse fighter than he looks.
Yeah.
Like, you see Santos in any one fight, and you're like, this guy looks all right. And he's put together a long string of wins in the UFC. Like, he's consistently improving for a guy who's been fighting since, who took his first fight in 2002, and who
really?
He's 36.
He hasn't been competing that consistently, or he probably didn't for the first
4 years off after that first fight.
All right. Yeah.
But he's been fighting since 2006 consistently. He's been fighting for a decade.
Yeah, like 2 fights a year.
Yeah. And he's 36. But he's still been consistently getting better. He also is still not amazing. Like, the big problem for Santos is, honestly, the longer the fight goes, the worse he gets. He starts out as a very technical, very dangerous fighter. And as time goes on, and as he gets tired and as he gets frustrated, that technique just starts to break down around him. He becomes wilder and less able to wrestle, less dynamic, and just more of the kind of what you think of as a traditional Brazilian brawler who has a very disconnected grappling and striking game. It's weird because that's not how he starts fights. He starts fights as this very technical, powerful striker who, with a very quick positional grappling game where he can just jump, great back taking, can really jump on opportunities and catch guys off guard with his striking. Mm-hmm. Adriano Martins is just kind of slow and solid and patient. He's good everywhere. He's a good wrestler. He's a good striker. He's a good grappler. He's got power, but he doesn't work in any volume. And he doesn't, he will let guys steal rounds from him at times. He'll let, he's not the guy who's going to overwhelm anyone. He's the guy that he's very hard to beat easily, but he doesn't give you a lot of opportunities and opening. But he doesn't do a lot to win easily either. He's hard to beat easily, doesn't always win that easily. He's faced some, he's gotten some big knockouts in his career, but he's also taken some really funky decisions that feel a little awkward. I'm honestly going to pick him here, though, just because I think Santos does break down too much and Martins is too hard to crack. I don't think Santos is going to overwhelm him early, and once he doesn't, Martins is going to be there picking at him, doing all the little things right as the fight goes on. But I can see this as being like a split decision where Santos wins the first half and Martins wins the second half.
Yeah, I can't add too much substantive to that, but I will agree that, Martins is maybe not an overwhelming type of fighter in a lot of fights, but he certainly has the physicality to do that in spots. Like I think in this fight, he's undeniably the more imposing athlete. He's very physically strong, very difficult to take down, good takedown artist himself. And yeah, so he may not overwhelm you, but he is very difficult to overwhelm. And he's not, all that easy to hit. The only guy who's really knocked him out was Donald Cerrone with a clean head kick in recent memory. And otherwise, he's been turning in consistently solid performances where maybe strategically the fight isn't perfect, but it's very difficult to beat him consistently in exchanges. So, and I don't think Leonardo Santos has proven himself to be like a master of strategy or game planning. Kevin Lee fight was probably the best striking performance he's ever had. He outstruck Kevin Lee, didn't just knock him out, but Adriano Martins.
I mean, it's early in the fight. In fights, his striking looks really good, and then as it goes on, it looks less and less good.
Absolutely. So I'm going with Martins by a decision. A late stoppage is maybe a likelihood as well.
I see it a lot like the Norman Park fight, only that Martins is much more dangerous than Norman Park. Yeah.
But Martins has 13 TKOs and like a similar number of submissions as well.
Yeah. So it's an interesting fight though, because Santos is definitely more likely to be much more aggressive and to be very dangerous early in the fight. Mm-hmm. Odds on that fight, Martins coming in at -190 to -250. Santos at +200 to +160. I mean, I'm favoring Martins, but I'm not sure that it should necessarily be that wide a line. Like I say, I could very easily see Santos winning the first round and winning part of the second round, and then this becoming like a question of who won round 2, because Martins won round 3 and Santos won round 1, and we're flipping a coin.
Yeah, I part of me thinks I feel like that what you're saying makes sense because I like Leonardo Santos and I would like to see him win, but also like I'm not sure if I would bet on this fight.
Yeah,
I just think like maybe there's some value in those odds if you really feel like you have a good read on it, but I don't know. Betting on Leonardo Santos, betting on like these two mid-tier journeymen is just a little tough.
Yeah, it's a little weird too because they have a long string of wins against guys that aren't bad, that are against good fighters.
Yeah,
but they've never really like Martins' only fight against somebody at the top of the division is Donald Cerrone, who was just a terrible style matchup for him. Mm-hmm. And was too good for him, frankly.
Although he did outstrike Cerrone in the early going in that fight.
Yeah, he did well early in that fight, but it just, I mean, Cerrone was just better.
Yeah, and then Santos would have lost to Norman Park. if
Yeah,
not for the
Santos
point
and
deduction.
Santos has otherwise beat. Kevin Lee is the best win on Leonardo Santos's record.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to.
That debut in 2002, by the way, was against Takanori Gomi.
I know.
Brutal. He was like, once upon a time, Leonardo Santos was the random Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy that Pride brought in to fight Gomi.
Yeah.
He was really... the Carlos, what's the name of the guy who fought Krokop in the wrestling mask?
Oh.
Dos Caros. He was the Dos Caros of his time.
Yeah. Very much. All right. That brings us to the prelim main event, or the Fight Pass prelim main event, Danny Roberts versus Mike Perry.
I want to see Danny Roberts knock Mike Perry out. I have a sneaking fear that Mike Perry's maybe not better than I thought he was, but just more dangerous. He has some things that are innately in his pocket in a matchup like this. He obviously hits very hard. He is not shy about pulling the trigger. He's not overcautious, and he has good timing on those shots. His arsenal is still pretty limited. So my feeling in this fight is that Danny Roberts is going to make Mike Perry come after him rather than running in and getting countered willingly over and over again like Hyung-Yu Lim did. And when we see that kind of fight, I do still think Mike Perry, we're going to see he doesn't really have a jab. He doesn't really set up his kicks. He's not that great defensively. He's kind of just a right hand and a left hook. But, Danny Roberts also got knocked down instantly by Dominique Steele in his last fight. It's not like he's better defensively than Lim by a long shot, but he's not invincible. He's made some bad decisions in a lot of recent fights. He's still coming along himself. So a guy like Mike Perry is always going to be a danger until you get to the real upper echelons of this division. I'm going to pick Danny Roberts. I'm going to say second round TKO. I still have no idea how Mike Perry looks after the first round. So even just surviving might be enough for Danny Roberts to beat him late. So he's just the more reliable fighter at this point. Danny Roberts.
Yeah, my read on Perry coming in, and I think it was weird because it was one of those things where I was actually pretty impressed by him, and I thought he would lose badly to Hyung-Yu Lim, but a lot of people were very much like, "Oh, that guy's no good." He's basically trash.
He's obviously a very impressive athlete. You can't take that away from him.
He's a very good athlete, and the thing that I like about his style is that he seems to be a very good athlete who he doesn't have a deep game or a particular he's not technical. But he's very he seems to know his limitations and stick to them.
Sure,
it's okay, these are the few things I do really well. So I'm going to have this very simple nuts and bolts, solid, simple game that allows me to take maximum advantage of being a great athlete without having many technical tools. It's it's a very different approach than his teammate
Nicholson,
Alex Nicholson.
Yeah, very different.
Also not a bad athlete, but it's just I'll throw a fucking spinning back fist. I don't care.
A spinning back fist, Zane. I think you mean 12 spinning back fists per round.
Yeah. And so Perry's just I'll sit and wait and look for a big right hand to hit you with. And that's that makes him a very dangerous fighter.
Yeah. He's like modern Dan Henderson, second Hendo comparison of the card before we even get to the main event. He's like modern Dan Henderson, but he didn't have to go through this process of learning not to chase after people and all that. He's just going to let him walk into my right hand over and over again. And
Roberts there's a chance of it. Yeah. I'm picking Roberts. I want to see Roberts win. He's a more technical boxer. This should be a purely boxing matchup, really. And Roberts is a much more technical boxer.
And a more likable person.
That plays heavily into this as well.
Yeah.
But there's a really, really good shot that Perry knocks him out in the first couple of minutes of this fight.
Sure, yeah.
You cannot watch Roberts walk into a big shot from Dominique Steele and get dropped and then look at this fight and be like, nah, he's got this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just you're picking somebody. If you're picking Perry, you're picking somebody with a puncher's chance. It's just a very decent puncher's chance.
Yeah.
So Roberts is otherwise the more technical fighter everywhere. He's also a good athlete, and he's fought better competition. He's shown better variety. He's never been knocked out. It's just, it could happen here. The odds on that fight, Mike Perry is the underdog, plus 130 to plus 110, it appears, and Roberts the favorite, minus 127 up to minus 160. Let's see. Under 1.5 rounds is even minus 150. So people.
Yeah. And I think it's quite possible it goes past that. Like, that was the bet I made when Perry fought Lim, and I was really happy with it because if I'd picked the winner, I would have lost money. But in this case, it doesn't seem like a certainty that Perry's going to knock him out, and it does kind of seem likely that if Roberts gets the win, it'll probably happen after Perry gets tired.
Perry inside the distance is plus 160, which is not way higher than the plus 130 odds you can get on him. But if you were going to bet on Perry on a chance, it would almost certainly be because he's going to knock Danny Roberts out.
Sure, yeah.
That might be the only thing I would say there. That brings us to a welterweight fight, Leon Edwards versus Albert Tumenov. Oh, this is opening the Fox Sports 1 card. This is a fun fight. Should be a really cool fight. This makes me a little sad for Leon Edwards, honestly, coming off his win over Dominic Waters, because Edwards in some ways he's a different fighter, but he reminds me a little of Danny Roberts in that, like, I really like the fundamental basics of both their games, and I'm not sure that either of them sees a lot of high level success in the UFC. Like, they have very different parts missing and for very different reasons, but it just kind of...
They're kind of similar in a lot of ways, too, though. They're like these rangy, southpaw, out like boxer-puncher types, maybe.
Yeah. Roberts just tends to work in a more complicated volume where Edwards has a lot more one-punch power, and Edwards has a really good wrestling defense game, whereas Roberts has a really crafty grappling game off his back and all that. Anyway... this is just a really terrible matchup for Leon Edwards because he relies heavily on one-punch knockout power. Like, he's a very crisp, sharp striker counter striker who really relies on the ability to have guys rushing in on him and counter them hard. And that's kind of the heart and soul of his game. And the thing is that because he doesn't work in a ton of volume, he's not as venomous a knockout artist as his speed and power and accuracy seem like they should make him. Like, he's a lot better at hurting guys than he is at putting them away. Mm-hmm. And Tumenov is, on the other side, a very good leading boxer. Very good at leading with his hands and not creating a ton of counter opportunities, and is very good at putting together enough power to finish people too. Like, because he creates so much volume and because he's so good with his boxing, he can really overwhelm strikers who aren't prepared to, I don't know, to find the right count, to take him out of that game, basically. And there's nothing about Leon Edwards' style that seems prepared to take Albert Tumenov out of his game. He's going to give Albert Tumenov exactly the fight he wants. And that just feels like a great matchup for Albert Tumenov. If he's going to get time and space to work and all the opportunities he wants to lead exchanges. He's also incredibly hard to knock. He's also never been knocked out. He's very tough. And even if Edwards hurts him, it doesn't seem like Edwards would be likely to follow up in the kind of way to put him away. So I think this is an Albert Tumenov decision waiting to happen, maybe even a knockout if Edwards isn't careful.
I'm not quite so sure. I like Tumenov. Everybody knows I like Albert Tumenov. Yeah. I think he's a really good transitional fighter. I think he's got a natural knack for that, where he will adjust his combinations on the fly. He will build strikes off of grappling exchanges, and he fights really well in those little interstitial spaces, makes those little adjustments. He has good feel, basically, for the fight. But I've also seen him struggle with long-range fighters in his past 2 fights, and even in some of his earlier fights before he managed to overwhelm those fighters. He didn't have an easy time with Lorenz Larkin, and in fact didn't really seem to have a lot of answers to what Larkin was hitting him with. He just kind of tried to double down on his come-forward strategy. And he got out-wrestled by Gunnar Nelson. That's not too bad. Nelson's a good wrestler. I didn't give him enough credit for his wrestling ability in that fight. But he also was getting hit quite a bit in the striking. I think he probably landed the better shots than Gunnar Nelson, but Gunnar Nelson's not a great striker. He's got a pretty... No. Go on.
I was going to say, I think a lot of that, too, though, is, once he was getting out-wrestled, it really changes the dynamic of the striking.
Sure, maybe. But that has to be taken into account with Leon Edwards, too. Leon Edwards has, unlike Albert Tumenov, pretty much only faced grapplers and some decent wrestlers, too, in his UFC run. And I think, if we look at Fight Metric, this is not the strongest argument in the world, but probably the least worried he had to be about takedowns in a 3-round fight, of which he has had 4. 4 3-round fights go the distance, was against Pavel Pavlak, the worst wrestler among the bunch, aside from Seth Bashinsky, who he knocked out in 8 seconds.
Yep.
And in that fight, he threw 110 strikes. And he only landed 36, but he threw 110. And it was the volume that helped him control the fight and win it. His loss to Kamaru Usman, obviously he had to worry about the wrestling and the strikes that came off of the wrestling. He only threw 67 over the course of 3 rounds. So it kind of suggests to me that maybe Leon Edwards is a lot more comfortable when he doesn't have to worry about wrestling, and he has had to dedicate all of his recent efforts to becoming a better wrestler. And we've seen that. In fact, we saw him largely out-wrestle Dominic Waters in his last fight, not just stopping his takedowns, but reversing them and ending up on top. But against a striker like Albert Tumenov, who's really at his best in the pocket, attacking the body, and kind of has to leap across space to get there, in a lot of his fights, maybe a guy who walks you into left hands and keeps a long distance is a pretty good matchup. And both of these guys are young. So, either one of these guys could make a really massive improvement at any moment in time. Edwards is 25. Tumenov's 24. I'm going to pick Edwards on the secret hope that he gets the chance to show off a better striking game. It's a small chance. Take it with a grain of salt. But I kind of have this worry now about Tumenov that maybe fights like this are not as good for him as they seem. That maybe he's I don't know. Maybe he really relies on being able to overwhelm guys with that power and on fighting guys who aren't comfortable striking, and that maybe against another really good striker who has a clear idea of what range he wants to fight at. Then again, Edwards could also come in and be Crookshank and come in there and try to be well-rounded and try to out-wrestle Tumenov and fail. We don't know. It's young guys. They make mistakes. But I'm going to go with the long-range out-fighter.
I think part of the reason to me, too, is that I'm picking Tumenov is that I don't think Edwards, at least to my recollection, he doesn't kick enough. And maybe that's because he faces a lot of wrestlers that he doesn't kick enough. But, if thinking about the Lorenz Larkin fight, the boxing was no problem for Albert Tumenov in that fight. He never, Larkin really never showed any part of the boxing game in that fight.
Larkin was very uncomfortable boxing with Tumenov.
And it was just purely the kicking game that he was unprepared for there. And I think Edwards is a better boxer than Larkin, but
he's not as good a kicker.
Yeah, he's not as good a kicker. And I don't know that he can do enough to make Tumenov uncomfortable with his style of striking. So, but yeah, I mean, the chances to walk somebody into to walk Tumenov into a big counter are there. I think I just feel also like having seen Edwards fight a few guys, a lot of whom were tough as shit, but and not finish them with his style. I then see Tumenov's better volume approach and better attacking approach against a counter approach that is unlikely to knock him out.
Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe just the guy who just throws punches and plugs away at the body is a better pick, even if the guy who's going to walk him into shots might walk him into a few.
Yeah. That brings us, the odds on that fight. Albert Tumenov is the favorite, minus 230 to minus 265, and 275 rather. Leon Edwards, the underdog, plus 231 to plus 180. I don't have a huge problem with those odds, but obviously Connor's picking Edwards here. So
I might put $1 on him there. Small bet. Like I said, it's kind of like I don't take my picks too seriously, which is why I don't bet that much money. But yeah. I don't know. I don't think Edwards is has no chance in a matchup like this.
No, certainly not. We've seen Tumenov both. Tumenov is a fighter who seems to be. He may be one of those fighters who is constantly both exceeding and falling behind expectations.
Right. He's kind of like Gunnar Nelson. Yeah.
He beats Lorenz Larkin, and he just whomps Alan Jouban with total ease, and he also lost to Ildemar Alcântara. So you have to weigh these things together.
Yeah, I think he and Edwards both need the right kinds of matchups. And I'm not sure we've actually seen Edwards in enough of the right kinds of matchups to know where he's at right now.
Yeah. All right, that brings us to Damian Stasiak versus Davey Grant.
Davey Grant is my pick. Damian Stasiak, for some reason, he's one of those fighters that kind of frustrates me to watch. His style is like John Dodson.
The karateka who only grapples?
Yeah, pretty much. He's John Dodson without the athleticism and the power. He's that completely processless fighter who's it's nothing but spinning kicks and then clinch takedowns or guard play and back takes. There are a lot of pieces to his game that are good, but they are completely disconnected from one another. His wrestling looks a little better in that Filip Pickett fight, so maybe there's something there.
Pickett's wrestling is also god-awful.
Sure, yeah, and Davey Grant is a good wrestler. He's aggressive. He throws combinations. He's tough. It's got to be Davey Grant.
Yeah, I'm picking Grant too. He's the biggest things here. Grant has a habit of being too aggressive for his own good, but that may be in part seeing it's in part inexperience and having taken so much time off between fights that I think Grant is just those are habits that he'll need to break over time, but I also expect him to break them over time. And Stasiak's, he's dangerous as a submission threat, but it's not the most he has to kind of be able to, I don't know, either trap you or overwhelm you. I don't feel like he's likely to get a submission off his back like he did against somebody who's very inexperienced like Mike Grundy. And otherwise, he tends to win, regionally because he was a just better wrestler and grappler than the guys he was facing. And I don't think he's a better wrestler or grappler than Grant. And Grant is bigger and more powerful and hits, for a guy who has very few KOs, hits really hard. So I could see this being actually being a stoppage for Grant if he plays his cards right and doesn't get sucked into a sloppy grappling match where he gives up a bunch of positions and has to fight through them to Stasiak, because he could easily do that too.
It could happen.
Still, I think Grant's the better pick. Grant is the favorite, minus 170 to minus 189 or to minus 195, and Stasiak is the favorite or the underdog. Don't know what's going on with me today. Plus 164 to plus 140. I think those odds are actually a little close, honestly. I think Grant should probably be a bit bigger favorite here.
Yeah, I think so too.
Stasiak is not a dangerous striker, so you're really betting on Stasiak's ability to out-wrestle Davey Grant.
And if you're going to go for a Hail Mary sub bet on this card, save it for Ian Entwistle.
Yeah. So, like, Grant is, 5'8", and a pretty big frame beyond that, just a very wide, boxy frame. Like, he's really skin and bones at 5'8". Stasiak's 5'8" too, so apparently it's not going to be a severe size advantage.
They say, but you always have to wonder. And like I recall in his last fight, they were talking in the commentary about how Stasiak's team was worried about how he would do at bantamweight, or maybe it was Page they were worried about. But
yeah,
I don't know. Stasiak just doesn't strike me as a very athletic guy, not very strong. And Davey Grant is pretty imposing. It's just his style maybe, but he is definitely a more dogged and consistent fighter. Like, he comes into a fight, he knows what he wants to do, and he just keeps pushing.
Yeah, Stasiak seems to kind of typify more what I see out of a lot of Polish fighters, Sayevsky, Pavel Pavlok, things like that, where they have all these parts of their game that are fundamentally, many of them fundamentally decent strikers, decent wrestlers, decent grapplers, but they just don't interconnect. And they aren't necessarily, some of them, the best athletes. And that's not saying of Poland in general. That's saying the guys who have made the jump, we've gotten some less than amazing athletes. Like Marcin Held is a pretty amazing athlete, but Stasiak, yeah, he doesn't really stand out to me. That brings us to Ian Entwistle versus Rob Font. And is this you or me? No, this is me.
You. Yeah.
I have a very sneaking suspicion that Entwistle is going to win this fight. The biggest suspicion I have of that is that Font tends to be a very flat-footed striker who really wants to sit down on his strikes. He likes to stay out at range, but he wants to sit down on his punches and throw with power, and he wants to connect. And that means that he's going to give Entwistle the opportunity to do a roll up on him, basically, to jump in and try and roll onto one of his knees and take it home with him. That said, you can't pick Entwistle here. Like, you could bet on him. There's no reason not to. I'm going to jump ahead and look at the odds here. Let's see. Ian Entwistle is a plus 274 underdog. Entwistle inside the distance is up to plus 317. And let's see. I don't even see that one place is offering an Entwistle by submission plus 350 line. So
that's the only way he wins.
Yeah, there's not a bad reason to put a chance bet on Entwistle by submission, basically. If you wanted to bet on this, it certainly can happen. But otherwise, Entwistle's, he is a live by the sword, die by the sword fighter. And at this level, he's going to die by the sword a lot. He's kind of, I don't even know if it's muscle bound, but he's got some beach muscles going on. Seems to tire kind of quickly. More than that, he is a high sacrifice fighter. He literally will throw his body into these knee bars with almost no thought for how he might defend himself if they don't come off. And so when they don't, he gets lit up hard. And Font has power. Font is a good wrestler and a good grappler. Is a well-rounded fighter who's decent everywhere. Doesn't get tired. He's not the deepest technical fighter, as we saw against Lineker. He just doesn't necessarily have the deepest toolkit to deal with somebody who can really overwhelm him. But he also survived that fight and didn't get knocked out, so he knows how to be cautious. Font should win this fight. He should be the favorite, but like I say, especially his very heavy lead or heavy flat-footed style makes me worry about him just getting rolled up on really quickly. All right. Talked about that more than I should have.
Ian Entwistle is the bantamweight Palhares. He's maybe not quite as freakishly strong as Husamar Palhares, but he is...
I think he's more Imanari than Palhares.
Sure, but to me, he's Palhares mostly mentally, not just because he goes for leg locks. Like, Imanari was, like, crazy and determined, and would just go for a million things and never stop going.
True.
You had to stop him. Entwistle seems to stop himself before you stop him. Each time he loses, Palhares is the same way. When somebody does defend those leg locks, it seems to break a guy like Palhares. He is the grappler's version of the heavy-handed puncher who hits a guy, sees him take the punch, and then loses confidence. That's him. You know, like he seems.
What, you mean Vitor Belfort?
Sure, yeah. He's the grappler's Vitor Belfort. He's Vitor Belfort if Vitor Belfort actually had a reason to run around screaming jiu-jitsu after his wins.
Yeah.
So, you know, that makes him really dangerous because he's so determined to get that finish, and for good reason. He's gotten 3 heel hooks, and in like I think his last 3 wins are all heel hooks. There's one rear naked choke in there too. And he's gotten a good guy out of there, like Anthony Birchak with the heel hook, a really solid fighter. And so, you know, it makes sense in a way, but then I don't even think it's, like you said, I don't think it's quite so much the aggressiveness with which he pursues the knee bar or the heel hook or the toe hold, but the fact that he clings to it. He won't let it go. And there are other guys who have leg lock games in MMA right now who do a much better job of using those leg locks as a part of a whole game. It's like expecting to get everyone with a heel hook is like being an omoplata specialist. There are other ways that the omoplata works that you're making a mistake if you're not using them. If you're not using your leg lock to sweep people and get to better positions, then, you know, it's a really chancy kind of submission to just rely on finishing it every time. And, you know,
it's not like guys don't know what's coming too. They know what.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and to his credit, like he doesn't need to take you down. He'll jump on it from any position. He will roll into a knee bar. He will do like a scissor takedown. He'll do any number of things to get into that position. But like so long as Rob Font has put in a decent amount of leg lock defense over the course of this camp, and he seems to be a pretty well-trained fighter, he's got a solid chance of beating Entwistle. Like that's all it takes is if Entwistle does not submit you with that leg lock in the first 3 minutes, you're almost certain to win at that point. Yeah. So Ian Entwistle is totally worth a small chance bet. I've got a bet on him myself. How can you not? He's got that puncher's chance. He's got that grappler's chance. But I am going to pick Rob Font.
Yeah. You have to pick Rob Font. It's just, I mean, I will not pick Entwistle in any fight, and I will not be surprised if he wins any fight.
Yeah.
You know, if he beat Dominic Cruz, I'd be like, shit. Well, that's what happens. You know?
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't pick him to beat 99 times out of 100. Dominic Cruz would win that fight, and if Entwistle picked one, when he wins that one, I'll know what's coming and why. You know?
Yeah, basically.
That brings us to the a bantamweight fight between Iuri Alcântara and Brad Pickett. Is this you or me? I
think this is me.
Okay.
Brad Pickett, it made me sad, man. Brad Pickett's last fight, I don't think he deserved the win. over Francisco Rivera. He put in a very tough effort as usual. You've got to respect a guy like Brad Pickett. Like, he has been putting in work for so many years now. He's got a lot of great wins in his record too, you know, like you have to go back a while to find him, but beating guys like Ivan Menjivar, beating Demetrius Johnson, beating guys like Damasio Page back in the day, he's got some really solid wins on that resume, and he has fought the best of the best constantly. And the fight with Francisco Rivera, he said, if I didn't get this win, I was going to retire. And it's a bummer because it didn't feel like he deserved the win. And so, like, you just get this feeling of a guy who should have retired and kind of knew it, basically being fooled into continuing to fight. And fortunately for him, Iuri Alcântara is more vulnerable than most of the guys he's faced lately to wrestling. And that has been more and more the saving grace of Brad Pickett's career, as he has kind of lost his speed and his ability to exchange punches on the feet. But, you know, so was Francisco Rivera, and it wasn't really enough to have earned that win over Rivera. Alcântara, like Rivera, is dangerous. He's much longer than Rivera. And, you know, he's powerful, and he's a better grappler off of his back too. So it's not like he's completely useless if he gets taken down. He's got quite a lot of submissions on his CV. So I'm going to go with Iuri Alcântara. I'm going to say by decision, because I think Brad Pickett is still tough as nails. It takes a really special knockout artist to get him out of there. But he ate way too many shots in that Rivera fight to have earned the win. And you know, I just don't know who I can really pick him against at like the mid-tier and up anymore. So,
yeah, I mean, I think the biggest part to me is going and watching that Rivera fight for Alcântara. In fact, is it so? Alcântara may be, he's getting a touch slower than he used to be, which is a problem for him because the interconnecting technical parts of his game have never really been there. It's been, here's all the flashy shit I can do, and my great athleticism connects it all together. But he's still tough as hell. He's still all like really, really hard to hurt and almost impossible to hurt, in fact. And he knows how his game works. Like, he's dangerous everywhere. He's not a great knockout artist, but he hits hard and he has good timing on it.
Mm-hmm.
And
he knocked Jimi Rivera down twice. I think most just flash knockdowns, like balance knockdowns, but he caught him at the right time.
Yeah. And it's just like he's dangerous everywhere. He's still a good athlete, even if he's not an amazing athlete anymore. And he's tough. And you're looking at Brad Pickett, and that toughness is fading. And as that starts, he hasn't been KO'd that much, but he's been much more hurtable than he ever used to be.
And Pickett himself will tell you that one punch is like kind of a joke nickname.
Of course, yeah.
Because like a third Dan Henderson reference before the main event, he's not Dan Henderson. Like, he can't just
finally somebody who's on the card who's not Dan Henderson.
Right, who's not Dan Henderson. He can't just like be like, all right, it's all going away, I'm going to walk him into the shot. He doesn't have that option. So he's got to go out there and have a tough fight every time.
Yeah. And that tough fight, like, it seems it's too many opportunities for a good athlete who can be dangerous everywhere.
Yeah.
Francisco Rivera is a good athlete who is dangerous in a very narrow alley. Like, Francisco Rivera has this narrow alley of danger, and everywhere else he just tends to fly apart. Alcântara he doesn't have any of, like, there's no narrow specifics. It's sort of like danger everywhere, just not that much specific danger anywhere. And that seems like a much more dangerous fight for Brad Pickett at this point. So I would not be surprised at all if Alcântara knocked him out or dropped him and submitted him, frankly.
Yeah, I think I'm going to bank on Pickett's toughness, but I do think he's going to get hurt a few times and lose rounds as a result.
Yeah. Odds on this fight, Alcântara -156 to -180. Pickett +148 to +125. I feel like I'm gonna say this, and then Pickett's gonna go out and win. But I think those odds are pretty narrow on this fight. Like I would be pretty surprised if Pickett won this fight.
Yeah, I mean it's Alcântara. We're once again kind of at that point where, in a way, we're picking like the worst guy that he would have lost to yet, and that didn't work out. The last two times that we've done that, it didn't work out with Bigfoot and so Pelele. And what was the one that was last week? It was
It was
or a couple weeks ago.
I don't remember. Damn it.
I'm gonna remind myself.
Yeah.
Barao and Nover.
Oh, Barao Nover. Well, yeah, and I knew I certainly didn't pick Nover in that fight. I don't know.
No, yeah, it didn't. Neither did I. I want to point out that didn't either. But the suspicion's there, and it often doesn't pay off. When you're like, this guy's losing, he's going to lose forever. You know, sometimes like he's still good. He's just fighting guys who are at their peak or near it, and so I don't know.
It would not be the worst guy that Pickett has lost to, though. I would say that.
No, but it's also not on the level of a lot of the guys he's lost to.
Yeah, recently it's something similar to Scott Jorgensen or Chico Camus losses.
Yeah.
Maybe even Michael McDonald, frankly, who got a lot more hype than he ended up probably deserving. But you know, he classically otherwise has lost several fights to guys that he's like, I have no idea who the hell that is.
Sure.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I don't see a clear avenue for Pickett to win this.
Me neither. It's just that I don't trust Alcântara all that much.
Fair
trust
enough.
him more than his brother, but not a ton.
Yeah. So let's see. That I did read the odds, didn't I?
Yes.
Okay. That's the end of the prelim card. That brings us to our first fight on the main card on the UFC 204 pay-per-view: Mirsad Bektic versus Russell Doane. This should be a showcase fight for Mirsad Bektic, which makes it interesting because it's also a fight that it's a more dangerous showcase than it should be. That should still be a showcase. You know, like. Bektic is just built much thicker than Russell Doane. Even if he's not way taller, I think Doane's a pretty big... Yeah, he's only an inch taller than Doane. Doane's got a really long reach. Bektic is built... He's a legit 145er. Like, he's just built thick. And he's got a powerful wrestling game with a very, very good base to go with it. And the speed and timing and power in his strikes to make up for the fact that his striking game is pretty limited. And Doane is a 135er. He's a slightly bigger than average one, especially with his reach. But he's definitely a 135-pound fighter, and he's not. He's a great athlete, or he's a good athlete with surprising speed and power, but he's not otherwise a masterful fighter or consistent fighter anywhere. Like, he can wrestle better than you expect, he can grapple better than you expect, and he can strike better than you expect. But over long stretches, he tends to he tends to lose any one particular part of those battles against good fighters. So I expect Bektic to come out here and to, maybe get surprised by Doane rushing out of the gate and popping him a few times. Although I don't think that it's a speed. I don't think it's the kind of speed that Bektic can't match. So I don't expect it to be total. I don't expect him to get overwhelmed. And then he's just too big and too, he's too much of a power wrestler to let Doane hang around with him, or to let Doane hang with him on the ground, to let Doane scramble and get out from under him, and to make that fight difficult. I think even as decent as Doane is there, Bektic just has this massive. He has a power and mass advantage to go with a very technically solid base, and with wrestling, like that's a huge problem. So I very much expect Bektic probably by decision, but if he's put together, if he has done more to solidify his ground and pound, could be a TKO win.
Yeah, I think this is possibly a more interesting fight than the last one. Of course, Doane is the third short notice or the second short notice replacement, the third scheduled opponent for this date for Mirsad Bektic. First, it was Arnold Allen, and we both would have complained about them throwing two prospects together, but that would have been an awesome fight. And then it was Jeremy Kennedy, which I was like, all right, I'm kind of relieved because Bektic has been out for a year and a half, recovering from an ACL injury. I want to see him get a softer touch. Now he's fighting Russell Doane, who's more experienced than Jeremy Kennedy and probably a little more dangerous, but also a bantamweight. I thought Doane had like the best minute and a half of his career in his last fight with Pedro Munoz. He finally threw volume. He finally mixed up his shots and got a little aggressive, and it looked awesome. He did really well. He lit Munoz up for a bit, and he got caught in Munoz's best submission. There's no real shame in that. But, this Mirsad Bektic, like everything you said about him, I think Mirsad Bektic is athletically, physically, and almost skill set wise, he's like a pressure fighting GSP, like a young pressure fighting GSP, and that is a tall order for anyone to beat. He has a lot of potential. The real question is what will he look like with ring rust? My suspicion is that he'll look a lot like Khabib Nurmagomedov did in his last fight, where he kind of looked bad for a few minutes and then visibly became more comfortable when he realized that it's okay to get hit, and actually he's been through this a lot of times before. Bektic is younger than Nurmagomedov and less experienced. And so I think he may go through that same process, possibly a little worse. And if Doane throws the same kind of volume, he may have a few scary moments at the beginning. But style-wise and physically, this is all Mirsad Bektic's fight to lose. So as long as he looks something like his old self and does recover that confidence after the first few minutes, then it's, he's the obvious pick.
And like the thing too, I remember somebody online a couple days ago was trying to draw comparisons to Bektic and Munoz. And it's just like Munoz is Munoz is a good technical fighter pretty much everywhere, or a decent one. He's mostly a very good technical grappler who's also a decently technical wrestler and reasonable boxer. But he's also exactly the kind of fighter that can get overwhelmed by somebody who starts fast with power.
And he did against Jimi Rivera too.
Yeah, like he tends to want to have a very slow, even start. He pressures with like swarming offense, where he tries to overwhelm people with the volume he's throwing with his hands. He's not necessarily the cleanest puncher. He wants to get in there and out swarm guys and relies on his toughness a lot. Munoz is not necessarily, he's not the greatest dynamic athlete. He's a very good, consistent, dangerous grappler. But you don't think, like, you see Munoz fighting in his stand-up and even in his wrestling, it's not like he's shooting some monster power double and throwing somebody to the mat. It's usually, okay, I patiently pushed you up against the fence. Now I'm going to chain these takedowns, drag you to the ground, and take your back. And once you get to the ground, that's where you see the dynamicism in his offense, but it doesn't really present itself anywhere else. Bektic is dynamic to the core. Like, he just has so much physical ability to make guys fearful, because like he reminds me of, in the same way of like Kelvin Gastelum, where even if necessarily the technical tools aren't always there, what you saw in a lot of Kelvin Gastelum's early fights were just guys who were like, they see that first punch coming, and even if it doesn't hit them, like, oh shit, I need to be 5 steps backed off, because if one of these does hit me, it's going to be a major problem. And that's just not a challenge that Munoz could present. And it's something, I expect it to be a very different dynamic between Bektic and Doane in that way, because if Doane comes after Bektic, Bektic can answer him hard enough and fast enough that Doane's going to have to really respect that quickly. So,
yeah.
It's just a point I wanted to draw because somebody brought it up. Bektic is the heavy favorite here, minus 588 to minus 800. Doane, the underdog, plus 559 to plus 400. I'm picking Bektic. I expect him to win. I expect him to look good, but those odds are a little absurd. I mean, they're a little absurd in like how outlandishly different they are than Diakise versus Sayevsky, for instance.
Sure. Well, I mean, and there's more questions marks about Mirsad Bektic. Like, we can pretty confidently go off of Diakise's most recent fights.
Yeah.
Bektic, it's a pretty big question mark because of the kind of injury he sustained and the length of time he's been away.
Yeah, like I look at these matchups, Bektic Doane and Sayevsky Diakise, as pretty similar, except that Doane is a better athlete than Sayevsky, but also a smaller fighter. I mean, just in terms of like the physicality and the prospect versus, a decent, reasonable, well-rounded fighter. And so Bektic should win this, but, this could also be one, like, it'd be a big deal if he lost, but he's a young prospect, and young prospects can lose. We have been through this with Kelvin Gastelum on several occasions.
Yeah, they very often do lose before they, there are more Tomas Almeidas than there are Khabib Nurmagomedovs.
Yeah, I think the major point for me is that Bektic has, to date, proved very little other than that he is a very good prospect.
Sure.
And that's just what it is. Like, he's beat good competition. He's getting better. Looks like a good prospect, but it's still a very young fighter who has got a lot to prove. So those odds to me feel quite wide, even if I am very much assuming that Bektic will win. That brings us to the second bout on the pay-per-view, Stefan Struve versus Daniel Omielańczuk. Is this you or me?
Me?
Go ahead. I've totally lost track.
Okay. This is probably the least interesting fight on the main card. Stefan Struve has not looked that great lately, and Daniel Omielańczuk is not going to capture anyone's imagination, though he is a solid, consistent heavyweight. I actually have a lot of questions about where Stefan Struve is right now as a fighter. He has taken a lot of punishment over the course of his career. He is a guy who is both very tough, can take a good shot, and has been knocked out several times, which, he's not like Alistair Overeem who gets clipped and it's over, nor is he like Roy Nelson who never gets stopped. He's the guy who absorbs as many shots as Roy Nelson until ultimately he is stopped, which is kind of the worst of both worlds. And he's got other physical ailments going on as well. He's had heart issues. He has also been having anxiety attacks before fights lately, which is never a good sign. Seemed like he was comfortable and confident against Bigfoot Silva, but he also won that fight in 16 seconds or so. So you can't really... It's
a meaningless fight.
Pretty much.
Bigfoot Silva means almost nothing right now.
Yeah, especially doing it that quickly. Like, you just can't draw that many conclusions, from what happened. We know Stefan Struve packs a punch. We know he's got pretty good timing on his right hand. He's the only guy to knock out Stipe Miocic for good reason. But I don't think he's the same guy anymore. And even as his old self, he always struggled to fight the way that most people agree he should. His best strategic performance was a fairly recent one against Antonio Nogueira, Rodrigo Nogueira, Big Nog. He had a kind of a rough first round, but for the rest of the fight, he looked pretty good. He actually stuck and moved. He hit Nogueira and then moved his feet laterally. didn't consent to exchange in the pocket for the entire fight. But then he was completely flummoxed by the wrestling of Jared Rosholt. And then, it's just, there's too many question marks. And I don't really have any question marks about Daniel Omielańczuk. He's not amazing, but he's really solid. He's not exciting, but he wins pretty consistently. And he's not like a knockout puncher per se, but he can certainly do some damage, and he's well-rounded. So I actually think I'm going to pick Omielańczuk here. I think he's good enough at long range to compete with Struve, who's never been an amazing technical striker and is always hittable. And I think he's dangerous enough in the pocket to do some damage. The biggest threat to him in this fight is not the striking, but the grappling game, because Struve is one of the best heavyweight guards. And, when he goes for takedowns, he can hit them. He's not a terrible wrestler. So if he gets Omielańczuk to the ground, he's got a good shot. But also, Omielańczuk looked better with his scrambling and his takedown defense than ever before in his last fight against Alexei Oleinik, who is a submission specialist extraordinaire in this division. And, maybe against a lesser level of competition than Struve, but still a dangerous guy to tangle with. And Omielańczuk won that fight. So he's got
I'm not actually sure how much of a lesser level of competition Oleinik is in Struve, honestly.
That's maybe a good point. Yeah, so Omielańczuk's got grit. He's well-rounded, and he seems to be in better condition at this point in his career. And he's got some momentum, too. So I'm going to go with Omielańczuk by decision.
Yeah, this is a weird one. I'm picking Omielańczuk, and the biggest reason behind it is durability and the likelihood that this fight stays standing, because I don't think either guy is going to try and hit a takedown. Like, Struve physically, he can't, honestly. Like, when you're 7 feet tall, unless he can hit like a foot sweep, he's never going to get his hips low enough to drive through on a takedown. Like, it's just not going to happen. He has to fall on you or you stay up. Like, those are the options.
Mm-hmm.
Omielańczuk's takedown defense, I don't know that it's actually very good still. Oleinik took him down really easily early in that fight, and then I think got really tired when he couldn't win it. It was the first fight for Oleinik back after a long injury. And once Oleinik got tired, Omielańczuk's takedown defense looked a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
But the big thing for Omielańczuk is he's never been knocked out. I don't even know that he's never been finished in any way, submitted or KO'd.
He's tough, man.
And he's a decent enough range kickboxer, functional, that he will get the fight he wants out of Stefan Struve. I think Struve will very much oblige him in a range kickboxing match. The only question there is, how reasonable is Omielańczuk's reasonable kickboxing against somebody who's a full foot taller than him? It hasn't necessarily served Struve all that well in the past, being a foot taller, but he's also, a lot of the guys he's lost to are way better than Daniel Omielańczuk, or way more dangerous. Even Travis Brown is a much more dangerous striker than Daniel Omielańczuk. He's not a better one, but he's a much more dangerous one. And otherwise, Roy Nelson, Mark Hunt, Alistair Overeem are all much more dangerous strikers. Rosholt wrestled him. Rosholt's just a better wrestler than... And Omielańczuk's not going to wrestle, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to... I expect Omielańczuk to win a super ugly decision where he hurts Struve a few times, and we get, the deeper the fight gets, the more cartoonish it is to watch these dudes. But this could be just a really ugly fight.
Yeah, especially because the reason for Struve's anxiety is not like that he's afraid of getting hit or anything. It's that he's afraid of gassing. He talked about it in an interview. He talked about how it stemmed from the Mark Hunt fight where he just couldn't do what he wanted. His body was unable to do what his brain wanted his body to do. And so that has now caused him to freak out. That probably explains the performance against Rosholt. And so against somebody else who maybe clocks him a few times early and he doesn't have a good few first minutes or he gets into trouble at some point in the fight, Struve might just shut down again, and it just might it's not high-level heavyweight. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Like, the biggest problem for me is the biggest reason I can't imagine trusting Struve to win this fight. Like, I just can't imagine trusting him to beat a heavyweight who isn't highly damaged goods, who won't go away easily, and that's just it. Like, I don't see any good reason to pick Struve based on the fact that he's a fun action fighter. Like, that doesn't carry the weight for me. And
I mean, what's the best win of Struve's career? I guess it's Stipe
Miocic.
And then after that, like, most of them are pretty unimpressive, or at least guys that you would expect to have like a 50-50 chance. Maybe after that, it's like Paul Buentello. I mean, who else has he beaten that's really at a good place in their career?
Probably Pat Barry. Honestly.
Yeah, I mean, Pat Barry didn't have a great run as a mixed martial artist.
No, but that's probably maybe Paul Buentello. Yeah, and that was a majority decision.
I do like Paul Buentello. I know he gets a bad rap probably for the don't fear me, fear the consequences thing. But it's also not like an amazing win.
No.
He was never an incredible fighder. He was just a fun one.
Yeah. So, yeah, it
was also a majority decision. Like,
yeah,
I remember
Struve. It was a very close fight.
I remember Struve getting beaten up a little bit in that fight.
Yeah, it was really close. So, Struve, this is the kind of fight. So now Struve is the favorite. And I'm going to tell you from the bottom of my heart, do not bet on this fight. Do not bet on Daniel Omielańczuk as an underdog.
I'm going to tell you the same thing, but I will also let you all in on the secret, which is that I already did bet on Daniel Omielańczuk. Hey, I won money betting on Curtis Blades and on who fought Walt Harris, on Abdurakhimov. I won money on both of those guys last weekend.
Shamil Abdurakhimov. Yeah, the consistency is just there to trick you, Connor.
That's true. That's true.
Stefan Struve is the favorite, minus 170 to minus 185 or 189. No, minus 190. I don't know. I'm not a very good reader, apparently. 195. 170 to minus 195. And Omielańczuk, the underdog, plus 158 to plus 145 or 140. And we are literally very likely in for a 3-round heavyweight kickboxing match.
What are the odds for over a round and a half?
Over a minus 145. They're not even.
That's still maybe not a terrible bet. That may be the safest bet in this fight, actually.
And even then, Struve has gone down a bunch in first rounds. So
true. Yeah. And I did just barely lose because I think Curtis Blades got Cody East out of there before quite a round and a half had elapsed, and I lost that bet. So even that is risky sometimes.
Yeah, like Omielańczuk could win this fight. He's got a much better probability of it than the odds suggest. But it's heavyweight. Goddamn,
it's going to be a trash fight. Let's move on. We've already said this is the least interesting fight on the whole card, so let's move on.
Okay, I actually think it's an interesting fight, but that's
interesting, yeah, but not to watch.
Okay. Next up, light heavyweight bout: Ovince St. Preux versus Jimi Manuwa, and this is a fight that fascinates me technically, because OSP is not an amazing wrestler or grappler or striker by any stretch. He is, however, an amazing athlete. He is a huge, dynamic, powerful dude who has spent his entire career at one of the smallest camps of any top-level fighter in the sport. And it seems like it's held him back all the way through. Like, that just... However, despite that, he has managed to pick up a lot of the tricks of being a veteran. He's learned timing. He's learned how to walk people into hard counter shots. He's picked up little crafty grappling tricks and things like that. He's not he is a reasonable, elite, high-level light heavyweight without being a technically good fighter, which is a very weird thing to say. On the flip side, Jimi Manuwa is also a very good athlete who has, it's sort of like the exact opposite approach of being a good athlete coming up from small camps, where Manuwa has he's kind of, it's kind of that Mike Perry approach where it's just, here's my incredibly limited game. I'm going to operate with as few tools as possible, but I will make them all very dangerous. And he hasn't, a big problem for him in the UFC has been fighting often. And he already got a late start, so he's already not the youngest guy. I kind of expect to see a kickboxing battle here between Omielańczuk and between Manuwa and Ovince St. Preux, rather. And that could make this a very difficult fight because Ovince St. Preux he's not a great technical kickboxer. But he's durable and he hits hard. And Manuwa is a solidly technical kickboxer, but he's not diverse. Like, he's not going to offer up a variety of things that OSP hasn't seen before. I think just because of that, I'm going to pick OSP here because OSP is also, to go with being big and strong and dynamic, he's very tough. He's very hard to put away. And he can hit hard. And I'm not necessarily convinced about Manuwa's durability against the real top-level elite. Like, Manuwa's obviously, he's got the durability to survive at light heavyweight, to beat guys at light heavyweight, to take punishment. But against the very elite, like, OSP hit John Jones with shots that I think would KO about 95% of the fighters in the world.
Yeah.
And John Jones is stupid tough. Like, that is a great testament to John Jones' durability, that he ate some of those counter shots and was able to work through them. I don't see Manuwa eating those same counters and being able to work through it. I think that's what it comes down to. And I think this is going to be a weird, slow-paced kickboxing match with Manuwa pressing and OSP countering. And Manuwa may have the advantage for large stretches, but I think that OSP is just going to be able to pull out these huge counter shots that he's capable of landing, and that one of those is going to finish it.
Yeah, I'm on board. Part of me was tempted to pick Jimi Manuwa here because, again, like he's a powerful striker and he's more technical than OSP, and it's really hard to watch OSP fight and feel really convinced about him fighting other top-level light heavyweights. But like I've said the past few weeks about heavyweight fights, light heavyweight is just one division away from heavyweight. A lot of these guys could probably compete as heavyweights, and the same kind of things matter more in these divisions than they do in the lighter weight classes. A guy like OSP would not make it past 3 fights in the UFC in lightweight with his skill set. But being tough and hitting hard and being an explosive athlete, those things matter a lot in a division where every shot hurts more and where everybody is less capable of taking them. And yeah, Jimi Manuwa, it might be a little reductive, but he has been knocked out twice in the UFC. And, granted, Gustafsson and Johnson, it's not embarrassing to get knocked out by those guys. But how much harder does Gustafsson hit than OSP? Probably not a lot, if at all. OSP
Yeah, I
maybe.
don't think he hits any harder. He's just more consistent about it.
Yeah, and OSP, despite lacking consistency, can be a lot more surprising. In a division where you're used to fighting relatively slow 205 pounders, he's really, really quick when he lets those shots go. And he does not mind, like, if it gets blocked or whatever, he will just fling that left hand, fling that left kick. And Manuwa's not going to be able to do what the other guys to beat OSP have done and control him on the ground. He may clinch with him a bit, but OSP's big and strong enough to overcome whatever slight technical advantage Manuwa may have as a wrestler. And, he's not easy to take down unless you're a good wrestler. Those are the guys who you can definitely time him, but you need to have good timing and a good shot and good control to make it count. And Manuwa doesn't have those things.
Well, I was going to say, like, one of the things people complained a lot about the John Jones fight, like, John Jones looked so bad against OSP. I think, like, what we really saw in that fight is how insanely good an athlete OSP is. Yeah. That John Jones, because, a lot of John Jones' game these days is based on clinch control and physically controlling fighters inside. And then being able to break them down technically once he's done that. And I think what we saw is just he could not physically control OSP because OSP is every bit the athlete that John Jones is and every bit as big. Mm-hmm. It's just not the technician.
Yeah, I agree. It's got to be OSP. I'm picking OSP, and I think it may be a KO.
Yeah. His ability, like I say, it's the ability it's not that he's technical, but he's been around long enough and he's learned the game long enough to know how to make happen what he wants happen. Like, he knows how to find the timing on his counter shots. He hit John Jones hard a few times. And then they were flush shots that absolutely looked like, one shot kill shots. And Jones took them, and that's testament to him. But it seems like something that in this fight, it just tips the balance too heavily in my favor, or in OSP's favor for me. Not to my favor. I'm not OSP. That would be a little weird. OSP is a favorite, minus 147 to minus 160. Jimi Manuwa, the underdog, plus 147 to plus 120. I honestly think OSP is worth a bet at those odds.
Yeah. Like, my first feeling when I looked at this matchup probably lined up with those odds. But the more I thought about it, I just don't see Jimi Manuwa putting together a consistent enough game plan to outstrike OSP. Yeah, I just don't see it.
It would be a bit surprising to me because even dudes like Glover Teixeira have found themselves getting hurt bad by OSP in those fights.
Yep.
So it really, like, you have to have exactly the right approach for him. And I don't see Manuwa just, his approach isn't diverse enough to me. So,
yeah.
That brings us to the co-main event, I believe. Yep. Vitor Belfort versus Gegard Mousasi.
Gegard Mousasi. Let's move on. Vitor Belfort is the only guy, another Dan Henderson reference, the only guy I know of to have been fighting longer than Dan Henderson in this division. He debuted 1 year before. He's not as old because he started really young, but he's been fighting since 96, and he seemed to have a renaissance. How much of that was due to TRT remains up to question, although it does seem that quite a bit of it was due to TRT because shortly after it was banned, he turned back into exactly the same Vitor Belfort that we've always known, a guy who blitzes and loses confidence and then loses. And so Gegard Mousasi, like, the shot that Gegard Mousasi was knocked out with by Uriah Hall would have killed a sperm whale. Like, that was a gigantic back kick straight to the jaw, and it took follow-up shots to force the stoppage, and Mousasi still wasn't unconscious. He's insanely tough. He always has been. He's taken the hardest shots from guys like, guys like
Mark Hunt,
yeah, and Hector Lombard back in the day. He has taken clean shots from a lot of hard hitters and
Melvin Manhoff. Although a lot of these were early submissions, but
Sure. But he has taken shots from these guys. Like, he did take a lot of shots from Lombard. That was a young Mousasi, and Lombard just lit him up for a round before gassing, and he was fine. He didn't show any effects. He take punishment.
OSP by unanimous decision. We were just talking about how hard OSP can hit.
Yeah. And he's adding tools. The OSP fight was the first one where we really saw Gegard Mousasi actually as an offensive wrestler, and he has been doing more and more of that lately. Vitor Belfort has been doing more and more of getting out wrestled lately. And curiously, he makes horribly bad decisions when he does lose confidence. He pulled guard, I think, twice against Jacare.
He always has. Vitor Belfort's his whole career is about how long his confidence lasts. I was just tweeting about this the other day. Vitor Belfort has won 4 decisions in his career. This is a dude with 40 fights.
Yeah.
Let's see, 37 fights, 4 decisions, 1 since 2001.
Which is insane. That is not a good and probably all the decisions since then he has been losing.
Yeah.
And even then, it's almost even worse because he doesn't even go to decision all that much, because when he doesn't get the finish win, he tends to lose by finish. And so, there is a little bit of serendipity here. The Phenom sounds somewhat like the Prodigy in meaning and everything, and Vitor Belfort has a lot of the same problems as a guy like BJ Penn, where he's got a long history in the sport, deserves respect, very dangerous, but just does not have consistency, especially not without the testosterone. So it's Gegard Mousasi.
The last decision that Vitor Belfort lost was to the Decision Dan version of Dan Henderson in Pride.
Yeah. And it was, if I recall, it was not a decision, not one of many of Decision Dan's decisions that people were upset with. He definitely won that fight.
Yeah. Anyway, the only thing I worry a little bit about is Mousasi being a very relaxed fighter early on in fights. Not being somebody who is going to take the fight to Vitor immediately and make him freak out. Somebody who will, he will probably give Vitor the chance to flurry on him at least once. That will probably happen. So there's a small bit of worry about that. Otherwise, Mousasi's insanely tough, and he has a great ability to turn mistakes from opponents into good offense, especially if they try and come after him. That's kind of one of the problems of his career has been that if guys don't come after him, he doesn't create a lot. But if they do and they screw it up, then Mousasi is all over them. And Vitor Belfort, coming after a guy and then screwing it up is kind of how Vitor Belfort loses. So, Belfort wins. He wins so often that you can't just be like, oh, well, it's in the bag. Mousasi's going to win this. Because Belfort, since losing that fight to Dan Henderson in Pride 32, that was in 2006, has gone, let's see,
quick little count
11-4.
Yeah, and he's beating good guys. Guys like Anthony Johnson, guys like Michael Bisping, guys like
Luke Rockhold and Dan Henderson twice. And Rich Franklin. So it's not as though Vitor isn't capable of winning very big fights against good competition. It's still almost all of those wins were in the first round, and any time after that, and if he didn't get a quick win, he got a quick loss. So this definitely feels like it should be the quick loss kind of thing, but I have that small pause of the fact that Mousasi has been this. He's always been the guy who it feels like he should be better than he is, even though he's still very good. You know? Like he has a little bit of that he has a little bit of the non-champion Michael Bisping syndrome where you're like, look, this guy is obviously good and obviously wins all the time, and yet you're still like, man, why isn't he doing better?
I think Mousasi's problem is much like Jorge Masvidal. I think they're very similar fighters in a lot of ways, and I think it's because he doesn't really know how to impose himself on an opponent. When he needs to. I think he's like, the expression on his face is not a facade. He's a very relaxed, calm fighter. You're not going to scare Gegard Mousasi or get him off his game, but he's also not going to do that to you. He's just too placid. He's too much of a spoiler to be like this destructive force that he possibly could be given his obvious talents.
Yeah. So the odds on this, Gegard Mousasi is the favorite, minus 315 to minus 360. Vitor Belfort, the underdog, plus 294 to plus 245, and I don't really think that's worth betting on. I think that looks right. I think Mousasi should win that fight, but there's Belfort always has too much of a puncher's chance to just be like, oh, bet big on Mousasi at plus 300 and climbing odds.
And of all the guys to fight Belfort, Mousasi might be the least likely to finish him. To really pounce on the fact that he folds when he's not doing well.
Exactly. All right, and that brings us to our main event, Michael Bisping versus Dan Henderson. Michael Bisping should win this. I should be confident Michael Bisping should win this. Yeah. I am still a little scared by the fact that he circles to his left a lot, and that he, for all of Dan Henderson's problems, his problems are not an unwillingness to throw his right hand.
Nope.
So Bisping will give Henderson opportunities, and Henderson will take those opportunities. It's just a question of whether the opportunity, whether it still means as much, whether there's as much speed behind the right hand, whether there's as much power behind it. There's still a lot of power behind it.
Let me tell you what to do, Zane, because I went through the same dilemma where I was like, obviously Michael Bisping should win this fight. Now I'm scared that Dan Henderson's going to win. Of all the title shots he could get, this is the most forgiving. But what you need to do then to calm that feeling down is go and watch like Henderson versus Rich Franklin. You know what I mean? Go and watch a fight where he hits a guy and the guy doesn't just blow up. And it's like, all right, Dan Henderson, even one punch power is not guaranteed. Dan Henderson probably has to hit Bisping more than one time to knock him out. And Bisping can survive that. I had to like calm myself, because you watch Dan Henderson beating guys like Hector Lombard, you're like, he's still scary motherfucker, man. Like, he can still blow your head off with that right hand.
And even when he beat Michael Bisping the first time, that took 2 rounds.
True. And that was a much worse Michael Bisping.
Yeah. Michael Bisping is much better. His game is much tighter. His approach is much better. His defense has improved. Mm-hmm. Everything about his game has improved, and it doesn't get sacrificed. There's not as much of an athletic sacrifice because he was never that much of an athlete to begin with. So,
yeah.
It's like, oh, he's not the same athlete, doesn't have the same cardio he used to. It's like, yeah, but, his game was never centered around being a great athlete. It was centered around having great cardio, but he's found some finishing ability, so that matters a little less. Mm-hmm. And, well, he's actually always been a much better finisher than people gave him credit for.
True, but I think he's better now than he ever was before.
Yeah. So, yeah, you got to pick Bisping, but there's still that tease that Henderson, unlike a lot of old fighters who get really cautious as they get old, Henderson has not learned caution. Caution has not come with age. He is still exactly as willing, if you march in on him, to throw his right hand and throw it as often as he can. And that makes him super dangerous. And Bisping, he's better. He's defensively better. He moves better. He will still circle a bit to his. He will still circle to his left, not nearly as badly as he used to, and he is still going to open himself up, but not as badly as he used to. And so it's just a question. Like, you got to pick Bisping, but it's going to be an interesting fight. Like, I'm excited to see it. I'm excited to see it happen.
Yeah, I do think Henderson has learned a bit of caution lately, a very pragmatic kind of caution because I think he now knows for certain that he can't take even glancing shots the way that he used to.
Yeah.
Like the shot that knocked him over and the way he fell after Mousasi just kind of clipped him on the temple. That's not a good look.
Yeah.
So I think he now knows. But every fighter goes through phases. Dan Henderson has gone through like 4 phases over the course of his career. He was a grinder early on, guy who probably typified best by his fights with like Carlos Newton or Ninja Hua. That second one being a bad decision, but that was decision Dan. Then he was a guy who realized he could hit hard, but mostly did it in scrambles, like used his wrestling to create shots, stopped other people's takedowns and clipped them as they went for it. And that was like the Renzo Gracie fight, some of the Wanderlei Silva fight, not quite as clean technically. And then he was this come forward, intelligent power puncher. And I think the first time we really saw that totally come together was against Michael Bisping. And that era kind of ended with the Shogun fight, the first Shogun fight. And then he was still trying to do that and couldn't make it work for a few years. And now I think he's trying to be a counterpuncher because he knows that all he has left is the ability to see an opening and the ability to nail it with one of the hardest punches the sport of MMA has ever known. And it didn't work against Vitor Belfort, but that was obviously a different approach than he took to Vitor Belfort the last time, because in their second fight, he came right after Vitor and got lifted clean off his feet by an uppercut up to the chin. He was much more cautious in their third fight and, he's still slower. There's no amount of smart fighting that can make up for that. But against guys like Tim Boetsch and Hector Lombard, he was still impressively quick on the trigger with that right hand. The first counter right that hurt Hector Lombard in that fight was downright scary. Like, Lombard was there, he was ready, and it was like a 6-inch lightning fast right hand directly to the jaw. Henderson still has that.
Yep.
But again, like Hector Lombard, Tim Boetsch, Shogun Hua in 2014, these are not impressive names for somebody who's getting a title shot. Those are not the kind of wins that earn you a title shot. They're not the kind of wins that prove you can beat somebody who's at Michael Bisping's level right now. Bisping, under Jason Perillo, has been getting better and better. His technique has been improving ever since, I think around the time of the Brian Stan fight is when he had his first fight with Jason Perillo. He's had his ups and downs, but he has only lost to the best fighters in the division. And he has had probably the 4 best performances of his career in a row now since April of 2015. CB Dalloway fight proved that he had a little more power and better combination punching. Talis Leitis fight proved that he could still move. Even if he got a little tired late in that fight, he could still move and beat a guy up with kicks and punches. Silva fight, putting all that together. And then the Rockhold fight, you got a first-round KO over like an outstandingly good opponent. So you have to pick Michael Bisping. And part of me really, it's the only time I felt that I've wanted to see Dan Henderson lose, because I want to see Bisping get his revenge. I like Michael Bisping. As I've said many times, he is a dick. And as Bisping has said many times, he's a dick. But at this point, he is our dick. He belongs to the MMA community. He's a beloved antagonist. And so I would like to see him get this, because I know he's probably wanted this for a long time. But it will also be pretty amazing if Dan Henderson ends his career with a UFC title, and this is his best possible chance of doing that against probably the least elite fighter in the division, in Michael Bisping, in terms of athletic ability.
Yeah, I mean, Bisping is the guy who's least likely to blitz Dan Henderson with amazing speed and just crack him and take him out before Henderson knows what's happening.
Yeah,
Bisping
absolutely.
is going to have to be crafty and walk him down. And try and find a way to get inside and get around that right hand. And
that worked out just fine for Gegard Mousasi, who's similar. Like, he didn't have any trouble with Dan Henderson. But, Mousasi can also afford to take Dan Henderson's right hand, unlike most other fighters. And I think Bisping probably, in some part of his head, knows that he can't. So
it's going to be a weird one. I'm excited for it. I'm actually, very much looking forward to this fight.
Me too. I'm going to be on the edge of my seat, even if it lasts 30 seconds. I'm looking forward to it. I don't know why, really, but I will enjoy it.
Yeah. The odds on that, Bisping is the favorite, -200 to -245 or 250, and Dan Henderson, the underdog, +211 to +165. And I don't have a problem with those odds, honestly.
I think the odds are spot on. I did put a bet on this fight, and it was for it to last less than 2.5 rounds. I think it's a fairly forgiving number. I got that at -125 when I made that bet. I don't know what the line is now.
Still the line I'm seeing.
Yeah, so, I mean, Dan Henderson can't take a shot anymore. Michael Bisping probably can't take Dan Henderson's. No matter who wins, I think it's a pretty good chance it ends fairly early. So, and 2.5, I mean, that's a pretty good margin for error.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty forgiving line. So, any other recap?
That's about it.
All right. Well, on that note, you can find me on Twitter at TheseAnytime. You can find Connor on Twitter at BoxingBush. That's BUSCH. You can find both of us over at BloodyElbow.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, and you should be because that's where it's broadcasting, give it a like. That's the thumbs up down there. Subscribe to MMANation.com. That's our YouTube channel. That's where you get all the latest Bloody Elbow shows, interviews, analysis, all this stuff. I'll be coming at you with the 6th round after the fights. We'll be having Knuckle Up after that on Sunday, and then we'll be back next week to get ready for what's it next week? Damn it!
Just got canceled, actually, the Manila card.
But there's another card too on top of it, right?
Was there?
It was a 2. Wasn't that the 2-event day?
Oh, God, was it?
Yeah. So next. Oh no, it's not actually. I thought it was, but
thank God.
Yeah. Okay. So we are going to be gone next week. So we'll still have the we'll still have If I Did It and all our other shows, Heavy Hands, all that good stuff. I'll probably try to come up with something else. Maybe we'll do that bad fight vivisection.
Sure.
Or bad fight breakdown recap kind of thing.
That's not a bad idea. We can put out a little schedule and watch some terrible fights.
Yeah, so that might be a good idea for next week since there's no event. We'll try to get that together. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.